So, moving on to buses.
Yeah, so if we, I can
Because
tell
we are
that
52 minutes in.
I was going to say, I can tell that
Yeah.
you're trying to
I'm
move
trying to
this
move it
on.
on because we're 52 minutes in and I also have to cook dinner.
I'm sorry. I did warn you this could be a longer.
I know.
Hello and welcome back to Rails to Nowhere. My name is Simon, and joining me is, as ever, the fantastic Ella.
Hello. Slightly unwell.
Slightly unwell, Ella, but we're making content because it's what the algorithm demands of us. Although we're not yet slaves to the algorithm, I don't think.
We never shall be. What are we doing?
So today we're continuing our discussion of the New Works programme, and we are talking about buses and mostly trams. I was writing the script for this and it's kind of turned into some buses and a lot of trams. Me and Aaron talked a lot about buses back in episode 7 when we talked about the passage of the London Passenger Transport Act. So we've kind of already talked a lot about the history of buses with London Transport. So this is talking a little bit about buses and also mostly about the history of the tram network in London.
It's one of those things where to understand one, I think you have to understand the other.
Yes.
With it, and to understand also things like where the tube goes, you have to understand where the buses and trams are going, because
Yeah, exactly.
otherwise you can't understand it, because these things are integrated in ways which may not seem like it. They're related in weird ways.
Yeah. And I know there are some who will tell us off for talking about buses and trams in the same breath because buses and trams are not the same thing, and they're not.
They are not.
But they're more homogenous than the underground and the buses and the trams to a degree.
Yes.
And certainly from London Transport's point of view, they are, certainly from Frank Pick and Lord Ashfield's point of view, they are basically the same thing as far as they're concerned, just one happens to be on rails. And I don't necessarily agree with that position, but that's certainly the policy position that London Transport takes in this period. So that's why we're dealing with these two together.
And it certainly reflects as well on thinkings that are going on during this period.
Yes.
There are similar periods, and it will come up in next season, where buses and trams are considered to be almost one in the same by certain companies.
Yep.
Especially the smaller the transport operation, they are very much seen as one in the same, even though it's very difficult to. You can't really call them one in the same because just they are inherently limited in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
But I think it's because they are road-going vehicles that happen to share a carriageway of some description.
Yes.
You get this overlap. That and their operating costs and other things, it changes how things are viewed.
Yeah. So I've been doing sort of literal literature reviews as we've been going through this. So this one's going to be really short, because researching buses and trams in London's transport history has been a nightmare.
Yes, it is one of the most complicated things.
It's hugely complicated, and there's not a huge amount written about London's, but okay, bus nerds out there are going to shout at me. There's loads and loads of books about buses, and there are quite a few books about the trams in London. The problem is, even more so than the railways and the underground, they are dominated by what I would call nostalgia picture books.
Yes, which is something that I found very frustrating in my research as well. I've not researched London buses as a topic to discuss on its own, but it has played into a lot of work that I have done myself, and it is very hard, much harder than researching railways even, to try and understand how these systems worked. And the number of times I've just been forced to go and pull archive documents because you cannot get anything, unfortunately, from the literature.
Yeah.
And this isn't a criticism of, not derogatory, but called, in some ways kind of unfairly, nostalgia picture books, but they are and those are very important.
They're an important resource in their own right, yes.
Yes, but they are inherently limited in what they talk about,
Yeah.
and they focus on a certain demographic, and they focus on providing a certain information density that just
Yeah.
is not helpful, unfortunately.
Yeah, and they're often relatively
Mm.
light on information density. They also focus usually on the technical aspects, so the vehicles and the buildings and the places, rather than the sort of narrative of the history.
Which is not to say I don't enjoy one, because I do
Oh,
love a good
absolutely,
picture of a
absolutely.
bus.
I've got a whole pile of such things for mostly trains because that's what I'm interested in, predominantly. So mostly for this episode, we've been relying a lot on primary sources, which is one of the reasons why it's taken a little longer to write this and process it than intended, and one of the reasons why buses and trams didn't feature quite as heavily in my actual dissertation as I'd hoped for, because it just ended up being more work than I had time for, because a year is not actually that long to go from concept to finished 10,000 word document. In terms of actual books, for this episode, obviously all the sources are in the bibliography in the show. They'll either be in the show notes, or they're tending to only appear on Patreon now, because the bibliographies for the episodes are getting so long. They're too long for Podbean's descriptions.
However, you can go and have a look at them, I
Yeah.
believe, because they're released as free items on the Patreon, so you can go and look
Yes.
at the app.
The day that this goes live on the mainline feed, the Patreon post will go free. It will become available to everyone, so you can view it on Patreon. Sorry, yes, I should clarify that. You don't have to
Yes.
pay us to view the bibliography.
No, that would be unfair.
In terms of this episode, the principal literature book sources, and I like sort of talking about books because it means they're easier for people to look at. And if you go down to like the British Library or a local library, often you can access most books. In fact, you can access any book at the British Library, and you can access a lot of books through local libraries, through like cross-lending and stuff as well.
Yes, interlibrary loans, and you should use them,
Yeah.
because libraries more than ever need your support, and the
if you
more
don't
that you
use them, you will lose them.
and I certainly can vouch for that as
Yeah.
someone who has seen a local library just kind of disappear.
Yeah, so the principal books that I've used for this episode are London's Buses by Oliver Green, Lord Ashfield's Trams by Robert Harley, and London Buses Before the War by Ken Glazier. It's important to note that they all have their own sort of take and their own sort of bias. For example, Harley is very, very critical of Pick and Ashfield in this period, which is understandable for someone writing about trams that he clearly really is interested in and wishes had survived, and he is clearly quite angry that Pick and Ashfield got rid of them. And we'll cover more on that slightly later in the episode. Yeah. And you can like look up the website of the Transport Museum and things. They've got broad overviews of a lot of the history we're talking about.
Can I recommend an extra book as well that is
Yep.
not, as far as I can tell, on this list, but I have extensively used in my research? I highly recommend looking up H.J. Dyer's and D.H. Aldcroft's British Transport and Economic Survey from the 17th century to the 20th century. It's from 1969, the Leicester University Press, and
yes,
it's an amazing survey. And of course, they cover buses and trams as part of that.
Yeah, I didn't use that specifically for the creation of this episode, but I have used that in the past myself, and it's a very good resource. So in today's episode, we are talking mostly again about the 1920s and 30s, but we are also kind of doing a flash history of 130-ish years of tramway history in London. So if we start off where me and Aaron left off, basically in 1933 with the creation of the London Passenger Transport Board, what is the state that we find the bus and the tramway network in? Well, like the Underground, it's owned by multiple operators, but unlike the Underground, it's owned by lots of multiple operators.
Yes.
So there are two principal companies owning buses in London. There are the London General Omnibus Company, or I'm just going to call them the General.
Or the LGOC.
Yeah, I was about to use the acronym, and I was like, actually, no, General is way more easy to say. So there's the London General Omnibus, the London General Omnibus Company, which we will refer to either as the General or the Combine, because they are owned by the UERL. So they are part of the Combine. And then you have Thomas Tilling, which is at this stage the major bus company in Britain. It's owning a large number of companies across the country, and it is the second largest bus company in London. which is quite unusual for them. Usually they're the largest company anywhere. It just so happens that the General is huge in London.
And there are other smaller companies operating too.
Yes, you have the remnants of the pirate buses that we were talking about back in episode 7. Following the 1924 London Traffic Act, the smaller operators had begun to diminish and disappear from London streets because they'd been made less competitive by the fact that they were restricted in their ability to set up new routes. And this was one of the reasons why the General's getting so big, because they're able to buy these companies relatively cheaply. As me and Aaron discussed back in episode 7, the London Traffic Act had been passed due to concerns about the oversaturation of the bus service. It was not perfect. It had, as I say, it had allowed the General to begin buying up more and more buses, thus consolidating their position, and it had allowed the General to begin to consolidate its position against the tramways, because the Underground Group do own tramways. Specifically, they own 2 major tramway services, which are the London United Tramways and the Metropolitan Electric Tramways. Just to be confusing, this episode we pretty much refer to 3 different Mets. So we have the Met, which is the Metropolitan Electric Tramway. We have the Met, which is the Metropolitan Railway. And we have the Met, which is the Metropolitan Police, who are the licensing authority for trams and buses up until 1933. We will probably refer to most of these by their long names throughout the episode to avoid confusion.
This gives you an idea also of how difficult this topic can be to research when multiple organisations can all share one name.
Yes. So, as I say, in 1933, the Underground Group has consolidated a large number of the pirate buses into the General, and in 1933, with the passage of the London Passenger Transport Act, Thomas Tilling's operations in London and the General's operations and the remaining small independent operators' bus services are all brought under the London Passenger Transport Board. This doesn't happen immediately. It takes up to a year for them to integrate all of the different companies into the London Passenger Transport Board. I think it takes about 6 months for them to integrate Thomas Tilling alone, because it's so big. And because the way it's being merged is they're buying it by share buyout, there's a little bit of a period of raising capital and negotiating prices and all of that sort of stuff. So, prior to 1933, there'd been a variety of improvements to the bus service in London. Notably, as we talked about back in episode 7, the introduction of the petrol and then later the diesel engine had allowed buses to travel further and faster and carry more people than they had previously. So this means that the bus network's becoming more reliable and cheaper, because you no longer need a horse and a driver and a stable lad and a stables and all of that sort of stuff. You can now just have a couple of mechanics maintaining lots and lots of buses.
These also bring along improvements in efficiency as well.
Yeah.
As the engines get better, especially with the diesel engine.
Yes.
Buses become much more viable on the simple grounds of a diesel engine for a large vehicle is vastly, vastly more efficient. Is why we don't see petrol trains or petrol HGVs really.
Yeah.
But we do see diesel trains and diesel HGVs, because it's just much more efficient because of the characteristics of a diesel engine.
Yeah, it's more efficient, more powerful, all of those sort of things.
Yes, and it's also torque is the other big one, because a big heavy vehicle needs lots of torque. Go and look at the diesel engine. Fascinating thing to research as well.
But it is worth pointing out the buses are still noisier and smellier than trams in this period. And the engines are still quite loud. They're producing lots of oil and fumes out the back and all of that sort of stuff.
And we are before the catalytic converter.
And we are before leaded petrol at this point.
Yes.
Which, yes, I know leaded petrol had its problems, but one of the big things leaded petrol did was it reduced the noise of engines. So we are in really old engine territory at this point.
Yeah.
We also have the small problem that the Metropolitan Police don't like the idea of enclosed top decks on buses, and I'm not entirely clear why. But the Metropolitan Police insists that all buses have to have open tops if they're double-deckers. So this reduces the comfort of the bus, because it means that you're not going to get nice upholstered seats on the upper deck. You're not going to get any weather protection, and that's one of the reasons why you don't get nice upholstered seats, because they would get wet. So if you do get upholstery, it's not particularly great, but generally you're getting wooden benches on the upper decks. And while trams are also limited by certain things that the Metropolitan Police say they can't have, which we'll talk a bit about later, they are allowed to have enclosed top decks. So at this point, we've kind of got a bit of a swings and roundabouts situation between the comfort of buses versus the comfort of trams.
And there are other things affecting this too. A lot of trams are still a four-wheel affair,
Yeah.
which obviously without the articulation of a bogie means they can be quite uncomfortable and loud.
Yeah.
But as compared to a bus on pneumatic, well, not on pneumatic tires yet, we are still in the solid rubber tire at the moment. But as the
Yes.
pneumatic tire comes along, buses become way more comfortable than a tram.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
and it's kind of a pick your poison situation rather than a one is objectively better, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. So it's very much a swings and roundabouts situation. Buses are also still a little bit more expensive than trams, so trams are still the cheapest mode of transport in the city. During this period, we also find Frank Pick and Lord Ashfield lobbying and pushing for improvements to vehicles to be able to be made and looking for regulatory changes. So they are pushing specifically against some of the regulations being imposed by the Metropolitan Police during this period. And just before the London Passenger Transport Act is passed, the Metropolitan Police allow for enclosed top decks on buses, and they allow for longer four-wheel vehicles. So previously, the longer vehicles needed to be six-wheeler vehicles, but by allowing them to be four wheels, that reduces costs and improves
Yes.
various things that the company cares about. So there are improvements occurring on the bus network leading up to 1933. However, in 1933, when London Transport comes into being, the largest sector of public transport in London is the tramways. 43% of journeys across London are being carried out by tram, so it's a huge operation. And this is a system that's already in decline in 1933, and it's carrying that many people.
It's also important to remember that this penetration is not just in the percentage of journeys made, it's also in the network. As
Yeah,
tramways crisscross the city, at almost every turn, you will find some form of tramway. There are some notable exceptions, however. The London boroughs of Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, and the City did not want trams to enter into their patch, and as a result, if you look on maps from this period, there's some notable big holes were in areas of the network that really matter. And it means that if you're on a tram, you have to either go around them or you don't get service in those areas. And if you're someone in those areas, you're not going to use or you're less likely to use a tram because it's a walk to get to a tram, so to get where you can get on a tram, whereas a bus will just be there.
yeah, and this is predominantly due to snobbery that leads to these gaps in the tramway
Yes.
system, because the trams are cheap, they are affordable, they are a working class form of transport, and
Yes.
therefore these particular areas don't want working class transport cluttering up their streets.
Yes. And you can see this in the network design too. A lot of tramways go into the city and back out into working class
Yeah,
neighborhoods.
and they serve working class neighbourhoods to the docks. So major networks are Poplar, Barking, West Ham,
Yes.
Walthamstow, all sort of working class suburbs feeding into the docks. And so this big gap in the system is bridged eventually. In
Yes.
1906, the Kingsway Tram subway opens, and I think there is nothing saying more about the view of Westminster to the poor of London at the time, that their only way they let the trams into their area is if they are buried.
Yes.
And not only do they require them to be buried, but they require them to use a different power system than the rest of the network, so that those short periods where the trams are on the surface going over Westminster Bridge, their cables aren't cluttering up the streets. So they have what's called a conduit, which is it looks a bit like a third rail in the middle of the road, and there's like a big thing underneath, and the power draws out of it. You can look up tram conduit online or LCC tram conduit online, and you will find pictures, diagrams of it that will show you
Yeah.
much better how it works than I
It
can.
has some issues. Some
Yeah,
people argue that this is a way to bring trams, ironically, back into Westminster, which still opposes trams partly because of what they see as visual pollution.
yeah, it causes all sorts of problems. It causes technical headaches because you're making the trams more complex. It adds in labour because you need somebody where the conduit begins and ends to attach and detach it from each vehicle. I've heard stories of bicycle tyres getting stuck in the wheel, in the conduit, of children dropping pennies in to try and short the system, and even just run-of-the-mill stuff like water and leaves and dirt getting in there and causing problems. It is an operational headache for the LCC, but clearly worth it because the trams do continue running through Kingsway subway for 50 years. So by the 1920s, London's trams have moved on from horses to electricity. This advance in technology has allowed trams to be quieter, more capacious, quicker, and more efficient. And at this point, a tram can vastly outstrip a bus in terms of performance, in terms of acceleration, braking, and top speed, because an electric motor, even in the early 1920s, is way better than an early 1920s motorbus engine.
Yes, and even modern motorbus engines, quite frankly, it is amazing how powerful an electric motor can be, even a really garbage one.
Yeah, and so the trams have got what we call the Sparks effect at this time, and this sort of leads into a sort of self-fulfilling cycle of the trams get better by becoming electric and slightly more comfortable. They've got their enclosed top decks, so they've got better weather protection, although they don't have windscreens, because for some reason the Metropolitan Police don't like trams having windscreens, so the poor drivers are out in the freezing cold all the time. And this is a well-established trope, so to speak, in terms of how people respond to technology. And this is the whole thing with the motor car being attractive and the airplane being attractive. It's the modern technology, it's the new thing. You make something electric and suddenly it's new, it's exciting, it's really good. And so people are drawn into the electric trams, and they become quicker and more efficient and able to carry more people and a little cheaper. And so we see various impacts on the underground. So stations such as York Road on the Piccadilly line, which used to be between King's Cross and Caledonian Road, closed because of competition from the trams. We also see the same on the railways. So the original London station, the very first London terminus, is Spa Road, from where you cannot buy any train tickets today. And the next station was Bermondsey something. I can't remember what the other one was called. It's kind of next to South Bermondsey Station. And both of those close. Like York Road, they closed in 1915 as a wartime economy measure during the First World War. Those two never reopen. York Road does reopen following the First World War, but it will close again by the early 1930s due to being outcompeted with the trams in the area. And we also see this incentivise the buses to try and improve what they're doing and improve their comfort of their vehicles, because they're being outcompeted by the trams.
And this creates a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy of one gets better,
Yep.
and then the competition will improve to try and win back the customer base, and then they will just be in this continuous cycle of trying to be better and better and better amenities, lower prices, noise, all sorts of different things, just to try and drag someone back onto the service.
Yes, and so while by 1933 Frank Pick and Ashfield at the URL have decided that they are going to get rid of trams long term and replace them at this point with trolley buses, in 1933 this positive feedback loop of improvements on trams and improvements on buses to compete with each other means that actually, to the casual observer, it's not immediately obvious that the trams are actually doomed and on their way out, because there have been a series of improvements to the network and the vehicles.
The London County Council specifically are actually really keen on their tram networks. They want to keep them going. They are trying to expand them and improve them. In 1931, they had extended the interconnection between the Walthamstow, Leyton and Tottenham tram systems, which allows through running from places like Tottenham through to Walthamstow and on to Leyton. And actually that's mainly for recreational trams, as far as I can tell, because that's mainly to allow better connection out into Epping Forest. But the LCC are very pro-trams. They construct a new housing estate at Becontree in the 1930s, and they want to extend trams out to that area, but unfortunately they'd need to go through either Barking or Ilford to get to Becontree, and both are just like no. And that allows the LCC, not the LCC, allows the UERL and the General to begin extending bus routes into the area, and therefore the General is able to further consolidate its position where these sort of outer areas are not as enthusiastic about trams as the LCC is in this period. We also see a variety of improvements in vehicles in this period, with the London County Council refurbishing their trams, increasing the power of the engines, as I say, putting top decks on. Eventually, they managed to get approval for windscreens. They begin fitting upholstered seating, so very similar to what you'd get on older tube trains. Starts getting fitted to the LCC trams instead of the old wooden benches, so they begin to become more and more efficient. They're gaining better electro-pneumatic control gear, regenerative braking, and improved power collectors.
And some of this is technology that you see still today.
Yes.
Things like the regenerative braking and so on, and more advanced controls. It's things that you would not be surprised if a modern system was fitting that out, or even a modern system that's just trying to build these features in, because it's some of this stuff is quite advanced in many ways, and it also shows you how simple a lot of it is too.
And even the anti-tram combine is building new vehicles. It's building possibly one of the most modern tram vehicles built in Britain at the time. In fact, the most modern tram vehicle built in Britain at the time. They commissioned 100 Feltnam trams, as they are known. They actually have a official name that I have not noted here. They're built by the United Carriage and Cab Company. I think it's UCC something is their official designation. Yet again, you're seeing behind the curtain that I have not taken proper notes, and I've forgotten to know who actually builds them. But they're built in Feltnam, which is why they're known as Feltnams.
And they are lovely. They're fully enclosed, which is a big deal because the weather in Britain is garbage.
Yep, they've got stronger motors, they've got bogies, so they get away from a lot of the problems of a four-wheeler. They have air-operated doors,
which is brilliant for safety and also is quite advanced.
They have brake lights. They have warnings lights at the front and back that illuminate when the doors are opened to let people on and off. There's still complaints to the motoring press that it is impossible to know when a Feltnam tram is letting people on and off. And it's like, well, it's got big bright lights on it. So a lot of the criticism at them is levelled at the fact that they have separate entrances and exits for better efficiency and quicker boarding and alighting. Because on older trams, you only ever got on and off at the back. So you'd get on and off where the conductor was. On the Feltnams, you would get on at the back and off at the front, which is why a lot of drivers were complaining, because if people were only getting off and not getting on, then you could try and overtake it or undertake it, actually, and you might end up hitting someone who's trying to get off. But again, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the motoring press complaining about motorists not being able to break the law with impunity. But we'll come back to this a little bit, because the idea that trams get in the way of motorists is really the big driving factor behind them being withdrawn, as far as I can tell, along with the sort of class snobbery.
This class snobbery is something you see not just in London, it is a global trend.
Yes.
I love to bring up Melbourne because it's a brilliant city for seeing this stuff that's still surviving to this day, because Melbourne has managed to preserve its tram network, and the tram networks do serve a lot more of the Bayside area, which has historically always been the slightly less wealthy part of the city, the more working class, because of course it's near the docks, and all the usual things apply here. And the tramway network is a lot more dense around the Bayside region than it is around the hillside region, which is mainly the preserve of the multiple unit and the electric railway.
Yes. And so by the 1920s, there's beginning to be a sort of swing away from the trams. This very much the case at the UERL, where during the First World War, there'd been a little bit of a scandal. So Frank Pick and Lord Ashfield had worked to get subsidies for, officially Frank Pick had worked to get subsidies for the General's motor buses during the First World War, on the basis that they were supporting the war effort. I say it's officially Frank Pick because, and those of you who can listen to our bonus episode will know that a lot of Lord Ashfield's personal papers don't exist. But at this point, Lord Ashfield is working as a minister within the Ministry of Munitions under Lloyd George, and Frank Pick manages to negotiate that because the London General's buses are serving munitions plants, therefore they should get government subsidy. So while there isn't any official evidence, it
looks suspicious.
Yeah, it certainly awkward questions are asked in Parliament after this, and things are a little bit. It's considered at the time that things are fairly below board in a number of regards on this. But notably, even though a lot of tram services do serve munitions plants, notably the Woolwich Arsenal site in Woolwich is served quite heavily by trams. There is no similar subsidy arranged for the trams. Indeed, some tram routes are curtailed to force people onto these newly subsidised bus routes, which is also all part of the sort of scandal that occurs at the time. So I think it's fair to say that Pick and Ashfield are not seeing the tram as having a future and don't actually care about finding that future per se. And that's going to be the theme throughout most of this episode, really, is that Frank Pick and Ashfield are not looking for a future for the trams. They don't believe that they should have one. And as a result, London basically comes to a sort of stagnation in terms of the geography of its tram system. So there are some extensions, as I say, to the system. Notably, the LCC puts in a system. There are some system expansions in the 1930s using the same sort of grant money as the New Works programmes built on, but they are quite small and they're not particularly extensive. And London does not see what other cities are doing and follow suit with the sort of best practice that's happening in places like Liverpool and not Manchester and Birmingham, where they are modernising their systems or trying to, and they do things like set up segregated right-of-way. So this is the sort of thing that actually now with a tram system we'd be quite familiar with. The tram sometimes runs on the road, but actually often it's running down its own central reservation or its own sort of slightly off right-of-way where it's not getting in the way of the cars and the cars aren't getting in the way of it. And that speeds up services. And this is known at the time as sort of express tramways. It's kind of what we know, I guess, now as light rail.
Yeah, it's more common to see in modern systems than older ones.
Yeah.
A classic system would be something like what Toronto has. Meanwhile, a more modern thing would be something more like what Croydon has.
But yeah, so by and large, this is not a feature of older systems. It's not implemented in London, and that does limit the ability of the trams to be faster and more convenient.
Also, the key thing to remember as well is during this time, during the 1920s, the general opinion on trams starts to shift.
Yes.
The statements from the government and reports from governments state that they start being more like the motorist lobby, and they are saying that the trams are in the way of the motor car. They are a problem, and they are a problem because they can't get out of the way of the motor car.
Yes.
And they block up the roads and so on and so forth. And that's why either you get your express systems with its reserved right of way, or you start seeing the destruction of the tram system.
Yeah.
And this is a thing that occurs everywhere.
Yeah, and this idea that trams can't get out of the way of motor vehicles and are in the way of motor vehicles also restricts the ability to improve safety. So one of the distinctions between older systems and modern systems as well is that older sort of Victorian and Edwardian tram systems tend to run down the middle of the road, regardless of how wide the road is, which means that people need to walk out into the road to get on board the tram, which back in the days of horse and cart is not such a problem. In the days of modern motor vehicles is beginning to become quite a problem when you've got a tram running down the middle of a 4-lane road.
Yep.
And so there's this idea that actually what we could do to improve safety is we could build traffic islands in the middle of the road to allow for the trams to pick up their passengers. But the problem is this means that at stops, the tram would have to swerve out the way and basically block all of the traffic. And this is unacceptable because it would get in the way of motor vehicles. And there's also, I think, a legitimate concern, actually, that if you know a stop's coming up, motorists would actually try and speed past the tram, potentially cause more dangerous situations.
Yes, this is actually a problem in Melbourne to this day. If you look at a lot of Melbourne trams, they have big signage on them saying when the tram stops, you stop. And some trams even have pop-out signs and flashing lights and goodness knows what, because people apparently cannot be trusted to follow the law at the end of the day.
And knowing how motorists work, that one is a genuine, legitimate consideration, I would say. And so this again limits the ability to improve the safety of the network. So given that Frank Pick and Ashfield are anti-tram, it's not much of a surprise that in 1933, all of that work that the LCC's done to try and improve their system stuff like improving their vehicles. They'd even taken the Kingsway tram subway and they had reconstructed it in 1930 to go from single-deck trams to double-deck trams. That's how much the LCC saw a future for the trams and wanted there to be a future for its trams, that it's doing massive expenditure to increase the capacity of its key link between its two networks. But the LPTB take over, and Frank Pick and Lord Ashfield basically bring with them the idea that trams in London are going to go, and that the rolling programme of replacements that they had started in the 1920s is going to accelerate and continue. Hello, it's Simon. Sorry for the brief interruption to the show. First of all, a really big thank you for listening. It means a huge amount to me and Ella that so many people enjoy listening to our ramblings about railway and transport history, and we really enjoy that we're able to bring this information and research to so many people. If you'd like to help us to spread the message even further and to help us to make Rails to Nowhere even better, then you can do so over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. You can support us for as little as £2 per month, and in doing so, we send you some thanks, such as early access to all of our episodes, some extra bonus episodes, of which you'll have heard some snippets here on the free feed, and we send you some periodic written updates about how the podcast is progressing. So thank you for listening. Thank you especially to our patrons for supporting the creation of Rails to Nowhere. We couldn't do this without any of you, regardless of whether you're paying us or not. This podcast would be nothing without listeners. It's a huge amount to both of us. Thank you very much. And now I'll let you get back to listening to the show. The first replacement of trams had occurred in the early 1920s, with the Combine first substituting buses for trams in 1924, and Barking abandoning its trams in 1926.
And then we get the trolley bus.
Yeah, I was going to say there'd been a couple of smaller closures in some of the small systems before that, but those are the two big moments. And as Ella says, in 1931, we get the dawn of the trolley bus, which comes with our nice pneumatic tyres, which are becoming common on normal buses.
Yes, but the key thing about a trolley bus is that, like a tram, it's electric. It uses two wires rather than one, which is minor electricity things there. But unlike a tram, a trolley bus can get out of the way of the car. It is a bus.
Yeah, so it's sold as being quieter than a bus, quieter than a tram, because you don't have the engine noise and you don't have the rail noise, and more versatile than a tram because it can get out of the way of the traffic. Ashfield and Pick basically see the trolley bus as the necessary tool to get rid of trams, because
almost the magic bullet.
Yeah, most places you'll need it. And the first conversion to trolley bus occurs in 1931 in the Kingston area. And this is a little bit of an unfair trial, because what they do is they take a tram network that the London United Tramways have been basically forced to neglect since the Edwardian era. And the track is in terrible condition, the vehicles are in terrible condition, everyone's decrying it as a Victorian relic, which, interestingly, is a slogan that seems to be coming up again when we're talking about our current railways, even though that's not true. See recent tweets from Gareth Dennis about why the railways are not actually Victorian relics. Ashfield and Pick then come along, and the UERL fits new trolley bus system to this area, and suddenly, it's so much better than what was here before. You have to ask, is this actually a genuine comparison, though, given you could have just refurbished the system with Feltnam trams and improved the track work a little bit? And by and large, it's considered that it would be cost neutral by the engineer as to whether it was trams or trolley buses that got fitted. So there's not actually a financial incentive to replace trams with trolley buses, which is something that's often put out. So it does feel a bit like there's a little bit of dirty playing and underhand tactics going on here to basically force the trams out. And you do see that with some of the advertising. We'll talk more about advertising in, I want to say it's the next episode, or the next mainline episode. We're talking more about advertising.
Most importantly is as the 1930s progress, we see more trams being substituted with the motor bus and the trolley bus.
Yep.
This doesn't mean that there wasn't a continual investment in, as we say, Kingsway Tunnel, also tram shelters and other things were
Yep.
invested, but just not the same for
And
buses.
the LPTB say they're going to refurbish 1,000 trams, which then goes down to 500 trams, which then goes down to 300 trams. And I think it's about 200 trams actually get refurbished. So they do actually refurbish some trams, but they don't refurbish anything like what they say they're going to. And so through the 1930s, we see replacement, mostly for trolley buses, but in some areas also motor buses. Predominantly the motor bus replacements occur in places where tramways and buses already overlap significantly, and it's basically just there's a withdrawal of the tram service, whereas trolley buses happen in places where the tram route is not necessarily withdrawn, it's converted to a trolley bus. I think that makes sense as a way to put it, doesn't it? So if the LPTB is in favour of buses over trams, well, what is it doing to make its bus network so fantastic? And the answer is actually a little bit shrug. So we mentioned earlier improvements in vehicles. By the mid-1930s, the standard vehicle is the SLT, and these are significant comforts over previous buses. They are bigger and more capacious than previous buses, which makes them more efficient and all of that nice stuff for the company. And so they're slowly being rolled out across the network. They're also a standard bus, which the London Transport, again, they quite like standardisation, so they're slowly rolling them out and replacing existing vehicles. Notably, London Transport is keen to withdraw all of the open-top buses that remain. Mostly those are with small companies, but Thomas Tillings do still have some open-top vehicles, and they're replaced with SLTs by and large because of the improved comfort and weather protection from those vehicles. The board is also very keen on the flexibility of the bus network, especially compared to trams. It's much easier to establish a bus route and much easier to change one around ever so slightly. And in a city that is growing rapidly, this is quite useful, especially one that is growing rapidly away from the areas that had previously been developing. And these are out of range of traditional tramway networks, and we're not seeing extensions of the tramways really into these areas. So it's the motor bus that's coming and providing service to these areas. And so London Transport is monitoring these systems, looking at some of the output of what they're talking about. They have people out and about looking at surveying where new housing estates are going, surveying the development of them, the amount of housing, the type of housing, when people are moving in, what journeys are they making. They're putting this here, they're following what people are doing. They're not necessarily going out and following Mr. and Mrs. Smith from their front door to work, but they're doing what they call traffic surveys. So they'll stand at key junctions or outside stations or things like that, and they'll see where people are walking and going. And you can see quite a lot of detail of what the assessment is of what journeys are being made from these traffic surveys. And this is all going on to amended ordnance survey maps back at Broadway, 55 Broadway, which is LT's headquarters office, where they are then using these to plot out the changing growth of London to try and better match the service to the growing city. And London Transport sees buses predominantly as being a feeder service into the underground. They do recognise that there is a significant amount of movement within the central area, and that a variety of routes do provide a cheaper route into central London from various suburbs, but principally buses are seen as a way to move people towards railheads and hubs, so places like East Croydon and Wembley Park and Harrow on the Hill and those sort of places. They do try to set up orbital routes, and there are orbital routes in existence. But like a lot of places, routes that are non-radial prove less profitable. We talked about this a bit in the last episode about how essentially orbital traffic is kind of surrendered to the motor car throughout the 1920s, 30s and beyond. And London Transport finds itself struggling with this because it recognises the need for inter-suburban routes, but it notes that there are kind of differences in the way that these routes end up being profitable, which, given it's meant to be a profit-oriented organisation, is important for it. So, for example, in an example given by the head of bus operations at London Transport, he notes that the number 83 bus, which runs through North West London and passes such places as Wembley Park, Golders Green and Harrow on the Hill, is actually reasonably profitable because it is passing through various town centres, shopping areas and notably Wembley Stadium. Whereas the 152, which runs down in southwest London, doesn't connect quite so many areas of interest, finds itself to be much less profitable, and there is a note that even the weekend traffic to the one point of interest on this route, which is Hampton Court Palace, is not enough to make it break even.
Classic milk run bus.
Yeah, and this kind of gives the sort of sense of the problem that the bus network has, and that London Transport has generally in providing these sort of orbital routes, is because whilst they're vital to the growth of the city and the development of the city, there isn't necessarily the sustained all-day demand to provide them as profitable services throughout the whole day. But the board does expand the network, adding in new routes to new areas. In 1934, it reorganises the network, so there was a lot of criticism about the numbering system that the Metropolitan Police had insisted on, which was all a bit chaotic. So in 1934, the London Transport Board sits down and reorganises the system and renumbers everything, and this is when anyone who's familiar with London buses will know that there are various sort of categorisations of bus services. And this is when you get categorisations of the central area buses into one sets of numbers, outer area buses into another set of numbers. Trolley buses are put into the 600 series, and county area buses, Green Line, they're initially all given X as a letter, and then eventually they become 700 series buses. But one of the big problems that the board is facing, which we have continually talked about in this episode and other episodes, is congestion. With the growing number of motor vehicles on the roads, you find a increasing amount of congestion. And this slows down the bus network, and the bus network slows down the traffic. So the board begins attempting a variety of things to try and fight this congestion.
It's where we see the understanding of what a bus is meant to do changes, because up until this point, buses operated on a hail and ride system. A hail and ride system is you go out onto the street, you spot your bus, and you stick your hand up, and the bus stops next to you and picks you up.
Yep.
Which is incredibly convenient. However, it can be incredibly inefficient, especially if several people stop the bus in a very short span, which would be very common, especially in the centre area.
Yes.
And this is where we get the bus stop.
Yeah, so it's trialled initially in the 1920s because there's some complaint from some passengers that buses don't stop when hailed. It's not entirely clear on A, whether this is actually happening, or B, where or why this is happening. So it's not like, is the bus full? Is the driver just unable to stop? Is it unsafe to stop? It's not entirely clear. And so they trial fixed stopping points. And so then in the 1930s, the Transport Board begin rolling that out to more and more routes in the central area, saying the bus will only stop in these designated places.
And this has advantages. It makes it predictable where a bus will stop, obviously, because you'll have a flag. It tells you this is where the bus will stop.
And it tells you which routes will stop there, so that's really useful for
stop
information.
there too, yep. But it also is brilliant for the motorists because they know where the buses will stop, and they know that when the bus is pulled in at the bus stop, they can just go around it.
Yeah, and it speeds up the bus route because it means the bus is stopping less often, and it speeds up the traffic because the buses are stopping less often. And later on, this allows you to bring in things like prohibitions on parking at bus stops and things like that. So if you've got a multi-lane road, the bus can pull into a free space. To an extent, the bus stop is a very car-oriented piece of infrastructure. One of the more interesting suggestions I see at this point is the idea that to help reduce congestion, that maybe you'd want to close Victoria Coach Station, which, bear in mind, has only existed for a couple of years at this point, and replace it with a series of coach stations spread out around the edge of London, very much like how the mainline termini are. So the idea being that coaches and longer distance outer area buses would get to these coach stations, terminate there, and then you'd have to get on a local bus to continue your journey onwards into the central area. That doesn't come to be. And we still have Victoria Coach Station to this day, providing the principal concentrated point where coach operations can happen from London. And the board is also seeking to improve people's ability to navigate the network. So the bus stop also plays an important role in this because it provides a clear branding identity. So you can put a big roundel on it and it says buses, trams or coaches, depending on what's stopping there. I've been told by people that London Transport refused to put the roundel on anything to do with the trams because they didn't like the trams. This is not true. I've seen various pictures of tram stops with trams roundels on them. So you put the roundels on the bus stops and the tram stops, and that gives you brand identity. You can put information on there about what routes run through there. So this is where we get the bus stop flag. It looks very different. Well, it doesn't look very different. It looks a little different to the bus stop flag we know now in London, but it has buses, and then it'll say routes 1, 2, 7 and 9 stop here, and it'll say what the name of the stop is and where the buses are going. You can put timetables on the stand. You can fit a shelter to improve comfort. At this time, London Transport begin producing integrated timetables, which give a roundup of all of the services in a particular area and all of the timetables, both for the trams and the buses, to try and encourage people to think about how they can use it as a network. And Frank Pick also is keen that the bus network should get these sort of aesthetical improvements that the Underground's getting. So part of the new works programme for the Underground is new stations, new buildings, the architecture, as we discussed last episode, of Charles Holden and Stanley Heaps, among others. And Frank Pick commissions a variety of structures for the bus network to bring it into sort of the modern image of architecture. And this is particularly prominent because a lot of bus depots are more prominent in the cityscape than train depots. So the buildings of places like Neasden Depot or High Barnet Depot or all of those sort of things tend to be sort of buried away behind fences and down an embankment and kind of out of view. Yeah. Whereas bus garages tend to be right there on the street in the city. So very often the bus garages get rebuilt into the Art Deco style. Notable examples are places like Hounslow and St Albans. These are also prominent because they also integrate sort of early bus stations into them as well. So these are not only are they the garages for storing buses, but they're also principal hubs for where you can catch buses from.
Yeah, and then you get integrated interchanges.
Yep.
With newer stations like the beautiful architecture at Cockfosters. You've got Newbury Park and other places where you have a bus station or at least try to integrate with the underground service or even the rail service in some places, which is the case at West Croydon.
And at Cockfosters, the bus infrastructure is quite small. It's the nice little shelters, and then at Newbury Park you have the really grand. I think Newbury Park is the grandest of this era of bus station that gets constructed, with its big arched roof over the top of it.
Yeah, we don't get what I would call a perfect bus station yet.
No.
You don't get that really. It's only a thing I would say is starting to come about now. I mean, modern bus like interchanges, rather than having islands, which is quite common at this time, and like for example, outside Victoria Station is like an example of island bus stops at an interchange. Nowadays, if you're trying to build something really nice, you use like what are called sawtooth bays, where the bus can pull in and easily pull itself out, and you don't have to cross the passenger doesn't have to cross the street and enter into
bad sawtooths where the buses have to back out.
No, that's bad. That's a terrible design. But you want to keep it where the passengers don't have to step out and be in conflict with the buses.
With this design, the good sawtooth bay, we're talking about places like West Croydon and Walthamstow Central bus stations. Believe are both also the same design of right-hand running for the buses. So they loop round right-hand side. So there's a big island in the middle that all the bus stops are on, and the buses pull in with the doors onto this big island in the middle of the road.
Yes, and it's designed to minimise the conflict the passenger will come into with a bus or any other vehicle that could kill them.
So we have various examples of sort of Art Deco architecture going in onto bus infrastructure and bus buildings. If you want to see pictures of those, there's some links to articles on the Beauty of Transport blog in the sources list for this episode, and those have got various
Fantastic
pictures
website.
of those. Yeah, it's a fantastic website.
Also, the LTM image archive is another great
Yes.
place. If you just want to spend, like, Google, just pull it up. I recommend. You could lose your life looking at pictures of bus
Absolutely.
stations.
And this does bring us some sort of stark contrast with what's going on the trams, where we don't get any of that sort of architecture on the tram network, and indeed the only significant tram infrastructure is the Kingsway tram subway, and that looks very Edwardian. Yes, it's improved in the 1930s with its rebuild, but it still looks quite Edwardian, quite industrialist. It looks very much like a sort of New York subway station, which is very sort of out of keeping with the aesthetic of the 1920s and the Art Deco. We now have basically come to the end of our discussion of the New Works programme, both its underground component and its buses component. Very often we think of the New Works programme as being just the underground, but actually the LPTB consider the trams and the buses component to be part of the New Works programme just as much as they do the underground. But as we said back in episode 1 when we talked about the scope of my project and all of what I'm talking about here, buses and trams all too often get overlooked in these sort of combined histories of London transport. So I think this is an important point for us to revisit the research questions that we're talking about in this project, which was London Transport aware of the motor car having an impact on London in this period? If so, what was it doing to try and counteract that? And finally, if it was doing anything, was that successful? The answer to the first question, I think we can say now, is a resounding yes. They are well aware of what's going on. They're well aware the car is having an impact. They are aware that it's influencing the congestion of buses, the language that Frank Pick and that the government is putting out at the time. They're all sounding very similar to what the car lobby is saying about what it wants city streets to be like and its problem with trams and what it doesn't like with trams. So we can say that the car is having an impact, and we can also say that London Transport is aware the car is having an impact.
I was going to say, interesting, this language also doesn't change.
No.
In between then and now.
No.
The same arguments are brought up time and again by the motor lobby.
Yeah, and we can see that now with the sort of things that the current government's just announced about bus lanes and low traffic neighbourhoods and all of that sort of stuff being in the way of motor traffic.
Yeah, and the way that the rights of the motorists are being infringed on in their view.
Yeah.
And in the view of many motorists who are taking this into their own hands.
For the second question, the answer also is yes. London Transport is trying to respond to these changes. It's trying to meet the needs of London going forward. It's trying to adapt its network, expand its network, and improve its network to be able to meet the needs of a growing and changing city and to face up to and compete with the motor car. We can see, as we talked about in the last episode, improved styling to vehicles, improved comfort, improved speed, attempts to improve the congestion and to beat congestion and all of that sort of stuff, trying to compete with the motor vehicle for speed and comfort and convenience. We can see them extending the network, as we talked about last week, into areas that were not previously served or were underserved to try and capture people into the system as well. So we can see London Transport is trying, as far as it's concerned, is the right way to improve the system. And I think that's an important caveat, that it's about what London Transport has decided is the best way to meet these problems. That's what it's doing, which then makes the next question a little harder to answer, because the question of is this actually being successful is a little bit more complex and nuanced. Welcome to Simon Has the Nuance Corner. The London Passenger Transport Board sees the New Works programme as a success. It sees passenger numbers go up, it sees services being utilised, it sees people using these new extensions, it sees people using the new vehicles. They see the tramway replacement as successful. As far as they're concerned, when they replace trams, they replace them with trolley buses, which then have more people using them, and they get more money out of that. So as far as they're concerned, this is all a success.
Also, I think it's important to consider it in that wider context of the wider political landscape and the wider landscape of what is going on in transport history at this time too, because a lot of what we see the New York Works program attempting is what goes on in other systems. We see this from the smallest, most scrappy of systems up to the largest systems. They are trying to do similar things, and
Yep.
not all as successfully as the New York Works program do too.
And it's also important to note that the New Works program is phenomenally successful in building infrastructure.
Yeah, it's on a scale that is unmatched, I think.
Oh,
Since
absolutely. If we look at the London Passenger Transport Board exists for a period of, what is it, 15 years?
about that, yeah.
From 1933 through to 1948, of which 5 of those years are under the actual action of military engagement with Germany, and the final 3 years are in the deprivation and rebuilding period after the Second World War. So realistically, we're talking about a period of 6 years between 1933 and 1939 where the London Passenger Transport Board achieves a phenomenal amount of work. I think it is right that the New Works programme is remembered as a majorly successful piece of infrastructure investment in this country, and is, I think, a great example of what happens if you allow the experts in an industry to lead on the project and say, this is what needs to happen. We need to just spend the money on doing these things. Now let's put competent, capable people in charge and make it happen. And that's not to say that Pick and Ashfield are perfect people. And anyone who's listened to our, or will listen to our bonus episode that's coming out shortly on them, will hear our views on that. And that's not to say they're perfect people. It's not to say they're brilliant or that the LPTB system is the best system or the perfect system. But it achieves, in 6 years, it achieves a huge amount of stuff in a space of time that it took us to debate and approve the construction of Crossrail, never mind actually build the system.
And it's a thing that you would never see now.
No.
There are very few places, I think, that would be able to pull this off at any point in history. London is unique in many ways in its size of the city and the amount of money that it has at its disposal, especially back then. And even now, there's a lot of money available to Transport for London and the Mayor's office. But such a massive, complete rethinking, quite frankly, of the network will never happen.
Now, having espoused all the successes of the New Works programme, I do want to ask the question of, did Frank Pick, the great bureaucrat, the man of detail, who would spend 12, 16-hour days going out and looking at the network and making so many notes, did he in fact make a poor decision, a bad mistake based on prejudice and no actual information that says that that was the right decision? And I would say yes.
Yes, to an extent, as is the classic historian's way.
So I would like to start this whole segment with the caveat that I do not believe that it is realistic to expect that London's tram network would have survived the 1950s. The decision to close London's tramways was entirely in keeping with the thinking at all other British railway and tram operators at the time. It is entirely in keeping with a significant number of operations of public transport across Western Europe and the decisions that were being made in the American system, which are incredibly closely related to the way that the Underground Group and the London Passenger Transport Board functioned, as we've discussed before. However, the idea that there was a clear case for the closure of the tramways is, I think, flawed. The evidence as seen by the chief engineer for the London Transport Board suggested that it would be cost neutral as to whether they improved the tramways or removed the tramways and replaced them with trolley buses. Realistically, this means there's no compelling economic case to remove the tramways. And indeed, you could argue that had they put in more Feltnam trams and things like that, that they might actually have improved the outlook of the tramways without their removal and replacement with trolley buses. The Feltnam tram is in many ways the 1938 stock of the tramways, and I think it could have actually stimulated the same sort of improvements in usage that we see when trolley buses replaced older tramways, because really what I think is happening there is the replacement of older vehicles with modern vehicles as the crucial thing. Additionally, academics such as Tennant have argued that the very physical infrastructure of trams, so the actual physicality of the rails on the road, gives people a comfort that this service is actually fixed. It's hard to change routes, it's hard to withdraw, it's hard to alter it in any particular way, which makes people feel more permanence about the system and more comfort that actually the tram will still be there tomorrow. Obviously, as we know, that's maybe not the most well placed of positions, because they do and did close tramways from time to time.
But it's seeing infrastructure, and that's a very
Yes.
powerful thing even to this day. If people can see the infrastructure there, and it's true with busways, it's true with railways, it's true with tramways. If they can see that the infrastructure is there,
Yeah.
they have a feeling that that the service will remain.
And if we look across at Europe, we can see places like Germany and Italy who managed to retain various tramway networks through from the Victorian and Edwardian eras through to the modern days. We think of the retaining of trams often as being an Eastern European thing, so cities like Prague and Warsaw and Moscow retaining tram networks. But we see that as well in, as I say, in Western Europe, in places like Rome and Stuttgart.
I think also it's important to recognise why the East kept their trams in operation for so long. Well, why they still operate them and why they are so popular to remain.
Yes.
Because a tramway, while expensive to initially construct because of the outlays, the capex outlay is very high. The
OPEX is
maintenance
quite
of such
low.
operation is very low because you have all the benefits that a railway brings in operational efficiency, or most of them, combined with or a lot of the benefits you get from a bus
Yep.
and being on the street. So it's
And
very good middle ground, especially for low speed and medium distance, I would say.
yeah, and whereas in those countries they were retained because they're a symbol of the working class and a service of the working class, in many parts of the UK, they are lost because they are a symbol of the working class,
Yes.
and they are therefore shunned by the decision
And
makers making these decisions about what should and shouldn't be kept. I don't think it's realistic to suggest that the political landscape within Britain would have allowed London to retain its tram system
no,
beyond the 1950s. But I think if we look at examples, as I say, such as Stuttgart, Frankfurt, or Rome, we can see that actually it could have been, and it was possible for tramways to have a place in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and to bridge actually what was only a relatively small gap in tramways not existing in the UK outside of Blackpool. Because the last tram system the last first generation tram system in Britain closed in Glasgow in 1962, with the first of the second generation tram systems opening in 1992 in Manchester. It was only a period of 30 years, and I think the reopening of second generation tram systems really demonstrates that actually there was a demand for services on trams that is distinct from buses and distinct from railways. It's worth noting, though, that some of these second generation systems, particularly Birmingham and Manchester, are attempts to avoid having to build a real metro system. At which point I'm going to say that we need to build Manchester and Birmingham actual proper metros and let the trams be trams.
And I think that's true also where trams have survived this period. You look at
Yes.
Melbourne. Melbourne still does not have any metro system. And the suburban rail network that is branded as metro is not a metro.
You note that in a few German
yeah.
cities as well. Frankfurt, for example, its U-Bahn is a combination, is what's known as a Stadtbahn, which means it is buried trams on the city centre and trams on street running out of the city centre.
Yeah, and Stadtbahn translates literally to city railway.
Yeah. And 48 years after trams closed in London, we would get the Tramlink opening. It's an interesting service, the Tramlink. I quite like it, but again, it's kind of falls into the trying to be a metro without being a metro. It does it less than Manchester because London has a much more advanced and competent rail system than Manchester and Birmingham do.
But it is still
Not
trying
wanting
to
gloat, as I just said, build better in Manchester and Birmingham.
And the thing to note about Tramlink as well is it's filling that radial surface.
Yes.
that key radial service which the rail system in London just fails to provide. And also Tramlink is built on a lot of old railway alignments, the West Croydon to Wimbledon line,
which
the
served
New
poorly as
Addington
railways,
line,
but
and
were
so on.
much better as trams. Yes.
Yeah, they're railways that work much better as a tram system, but still fundamentally are rail alignments that could have been double
Yes.
tracked in a lot of cases and turned into a much more frequent and usable metro service, especially had you buried the tracks underneath Croydon.
Yes.
Whether
So
that actually would work is another question, but it's an interesting proposition.
So we round out what might now be our newest contender for longest episode with a conclusion that the New Works programme was mostly successful, but it's a bit complicated. So if you've bared with us for the length of this episode, I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank all of our patrons for supporting us. Next episode is, well, the next thing we make is going to be a bonus episode on Frank Pick and Lord Ashfield, which will be out on the Patreon feed within the next 2 or 3 weeks. And after that, we are either going to be having, depends on scheduling, we're either going to be doing advertising of London Transport, which will just be me and Ella, or we will be having Round All Round We Go on for a discussion of branding of London Underground. So it will depend on the scheduling of when we manage to do the recordings as to which order those 2 episodes come out in. I've deliberately written them so they can go either way round. And then after that, we will be taking a look forward across London Transport after the Second World War and doing a little bit of a retrospective on what all of this history means as a sort of concluding episode. And that will be the end of the work on my dissertation. And then looking forward into 2024, as Ella has alluded to, we will be talking about the Jersey Railways and Tramways, which is what she wrote her dissertation on. And which I'm really looking forward to, not just because it means I get to do slightly less of the production work, but because I'm really interested in actually learning about that myself.
Yes, it's a weird system that ties into a lot of what we've discussed today too. So.
Yeah. And in January, I've had confirmation this week from them. We are looking to do a roundtable discussion with History Indoors in late January. We'll be announcing more about the details of that as and when it becomes a little bit more firm exactly what's happening and what we're talking about and when exactly that's happening. But we're really looking forward to doing that as well. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and we'll speak to you in the next episode.
Goodbye.
This episode of Rails to Nowhere was presented and produced by me, Simon Sartis & Co, and Eleanor Ashton. Principal research was carried out by myself, with contributions from Eleanor. Rails to Nowhere is brought to you by our fantastic patrons over at patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere, especially our £10 and above patron, Valkyrie Lemons. Thank you very much for your support. If you'd like to help Rails to Nowhere for as little as £2 per month, then you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/Rails to Nowhere. Otherwise, you can connect with us on social media over at twitter.com/Rails to Nowhere or search Rails to Nowhere podcast over on Instagram. Until next time, thank you for listening and have a good day. Hello, Simon here. Due to the delay in this episode, we've got a new notice come up between the production of this episode and its release. So on Wednesday, the 22nd of November, our very own Ella is going to be appearing on Rail Natter with Gareth Dennis. You can watch that live at 8 p.m. on the 22nd of November over on youtube.com/Gareth Dennis. Thanks for listening. Speak to you next time.